Hello, welcome to Washington-Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. As widely expected, North Korea fired its first intercontinental ballistic missile in more than 4 years. The United States condemned North Korea's action, saying the missile launch is a brazen violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions. And North Korea said its leader Kim Jong-un himself ordered the test fire of a Hwasong-17 missile in order to keep themselves fully ready for long-standing confrontation with the United States. Now, North Korea de facto ended the moratorium itself imposed on ICBMs and nuclear weapons in 2018. Today, we'll discuss the rising tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Joining me is Bruce Bennett. Dr. Bennett is an international defense researcher at the RAND Corporation. He's an expert in Northeast Asia and military issues and has worked with the Office of the Secretary of Defense and with the U.S. Pacific Command and Central Command. Scott Snyder is also with me today. Mr. Snyder is Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of U.S. Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Welcome to the show. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank
you for having us.
There were Korea watchers that expected this would happen. Dr. Bennett, what do you think of the timing of this latest launch?
Well, I think that Kim is trying to get ahead of things at this stage. He hasn't been getting much attention in the world with Russia involved in the Ukraine. Even his ICBM launch caused barely a ripple in the U.S. media. So I think he's trying to grab some attention. And I think in particular, he's trying to put pressure on the U.S. and South Korea to compromise, to give him something so that we can get to the negotiating table. That is a big incentive. He's also trying to take advantage of the fact that President Moon is still president for another month, and hoping that he can get some compromise on the South Korean side before the probably tougher President-elect Yoon takes office. So I think all of those things are factors, but also we have to remember that a week ago, he had a failed launch, probably a failed ICBM launch. And that's not good. You want to have successes. So I think that was a factor as well.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, what is your thought on why North Korea is doing this now?
Well, I have a slightly different interpretation from Bruce. I agree that all of the things that Bruce mentioned are potential side benefits, but I think that we always have to keep in mind that Kim Jong-un has set his timetable in January of 2021 to achieve on a 5-year plan a set of objectives, and he's trying to do that as quickly as possible. And so for me, I think the biggest question as related to timing is really the missing 18 months between March of 2020 and September of 2021, where we saw no testing. And that's a curiosity, and I think that we've got to ask why that was the case. I don't think that the North Koreans intentionally held up their timetable in order to take advantage of events that they could not possibly have predicted would come about.
North Korea claimed the latest missile was a Hwasong-17 missile. However, some analysts in South Korea say it was not Hwasong-17, but Hwasong-15. Mr. Snyder, what difference does this make?
Well, I think the main takeaway from the test was that North Korea is taking positive steps toward advancing its program compared to November of 2017 when they launched the Hwasong-15. We saw the missile that was launched this week go about 1,000 miles further up in the air and stay up in the air for an additional 18 minutes, which is not insignificant, and it definitely sends a signal that North Korea is continuing to expand its range towards the self-stated objective of having a precision strike capability to 15,000 kilometers.
Dr. Bennett, what is the significance of this missile if this was indeed Hwasong-17?
Well, whether it's a Hwasong-17 or some other advancement, This is a much more capable missile in terms of range than what was tested in 2017. 38 North, for example, argued that the missile tested in 2017 was capable of delivering a 500 kilogram warhead, which would be a basic nuclear weapon that North Korea might be able to produce, out to about 8,500 kilometers, which would be just short of San Francisco in the US. This missile, as Scott said, goes much further. That means it probably could deliver that kind of warhead to much of the United States. Doesn't mean that this is the biggest missile North Korea is going to field, as Scott suggested. They may be having other missiles that they will yet field ahead, but they are very determined to be able to threaten all of the United States and really put pressure on the U.S. commitments to South Korea.
Starting from earlier this year, North Korea has been gradually dialing up the weapons it is testing. It was showing an array of missiles going from short to intermediate and then to long-range missiles. Dr. Bennett, what is the intention of doing this?
I think North Korea was testing the U.S. and also conditioning the U.S. They were trying to see how serious the U.S. deterrents were. You know, deterrence is all about convincing an adversary that if it takes a bad action, then it's going to pay a serious price. And so they launched short-range missiles, and the U.S. didn't do very much. They launched an intermediate-range missile. The U.S. doesn't do very much. And the intermediate-range missile they launched was on the verge of an ICBM. So I think they were pretty convinced that they could launch an ICBM without much of a U.S. response. And the U.S. response has not been very strong. You'll remember that Teddy Roosevelt said, "I speak softly and carry a big stick." In recent years, recent administrations, the U.S. government has spoken loudly and carried a very small stick.
I 100% agree with what Bruce laid out with regard to North Korea's strategy. It's really the frog in the pot strategy, where North Korea is gradually turning up the temperature in order to basically see how far it can go until it hits a ceiling in terms of the international response. And unfortunately, under the current circumstances, I think one of the biggest challenges that the Biden administration has is that one of the commonly used tools for responding in the past, international condemnation through UNSC resolutions, is no longer available to the Biden administration. And so it's having to make do with lesser tools, rhetorical tools, statements of condemnation. We're moving back to shows of force in various forms, as we saw in 2017. But none of these tools are as useful as the UN Security Council tool in responding to North Korea's trajectory on missile testing.
Mr. Snyder, what do you think Kim Jong-un wants to get out of this ICBM test? Does he want concessions from the U.S.?
Well, I believe that Kim Jong-un's objective is to pursue military development to become a strong and powerful state, a nuclear state, so that the U.S. and the international community have to accept North Korea as a nuclear state as the going-in proposition. And then, yes, negotiations can occur. It's just that the North Korean nuclear capabilities will not be on the table.
I think you can even take it a step further. Look, Putin has been demonstrating that by threatening nuclear weapon use, you cast a nuclear shadow over other activities. And Putin's tremendously terrible activities that are going on in the Ukraine, and he's insulated because he has this threat. I think Kim Jong-un figured this out. His father figured this out long ago. Now he's got a credible capability, and he's going to test us over time to see how far he can go with this, how much intimidation he can make. but it's also an important defensive tool for him to defend not only against some kind of an invasion, but also against dominance. And that's regional he's concerned about. He doesn't want either US dominance of the region or Chinese dominance, and certainly not South Korean dominance. And nuclear weapons are potentially his vehicle for breaking that domination by all of them. Doesn't mean he's going to fire nuclear weapons at any of those countries, but he could. And that's what Putin's playing on right now. He could.
So now North Korea has clearly abandoned its self-imposed moratorium. Dr. Bennett, will they move on to a nuclear test now?
Well, it's hard to tell whether they think they're quite ready for that yet. I think they've got more to prove with missile tests at this point. So I suspect the next step we'll be seeing probably in a week or 2 or 3 will be missile tests. But I think a nuclear test is something they want to move towards. The question will be, what new kind of capability do they want to demonstrate with a nuclear test? How do they impact the politics in the region by demonstrating a new nuclear weapon? Because the test they did in 2017 was a pretty big weapon, certainly up in the range of the standard US weapons, a little smaller, but not much. So what do they try for? Do they try for a much bigger weapon explosion? And that's an interesting kind of question that we have yet to see. The other kind of question you've got to ask is, are they ready for it? The key thing they have not demonstrated with ICBMs is an ability to deliver a warhead through the atmosphere, coming back in at ICBM speeds. They're likely going to try to do that at some point, either launching a missile over Japan or launching it from the Sohei station down to the south, out to real range so that we see how far they can send them. But also they have then the demonstration of a real warhead coming back in to the atmosphere.
Mr. Snyder, next month, North Korea will be celebrating the 110th anniversary of the birth of the North Korea's founder and Kim Jong-un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung. Will we see further provocations?
I think that it's entirely plausible that we will see additional provocations. After all, when Kim Jong-un announced, or when the North Koreans announced that they were going to abandon their self-restraint with regards to long-range missile testing, the other item on the agenda for that meeting back on January 20th was preparations for April 15th. And so I think that the fact that those agenda items were twinned strongly suggests that we might see additional military activities designed to affirm the legitimacy and power of the North Korean state around that date.
The United States condemned North Korea for violating the UN resolutions and acted rather swiftly. It called for a Security Council meeting and imposed sanctions on individuals and entities in North Korea, China, and even Russia. Mr. Snyder, will these work at all?
No. The UN Security Council is paralyzed. We haven't been in this situation for 3 decades. And so we've gotten used to being able to use the Security Council for various purposes. But it is no longer going to be at center stage in dealing with these kind of issues as long as there are geostrategic divisions on display among great powers, such as the ones that we see between the U.S. On the one hand and China and Russia on the other.
Dr. Bennett, are you also skeptical about these measures?
Oh, extraordinarily skeptical. I mean, how much did these hurt Kim Jong-un? Because the real question is, how seriously are you imposing a cost on Kim? And deterrence is about letting him know beforehand that he's going to pay a serious price. And yet, as I said, we make big statements. We're not being specific and demonstrating a will to impose serious costs. I think we've gotten stuck in the traditional measures. We're not noticing that Kim is very sensitive about outside information. And we just aren't using that. He said that K-pop and South Korean culture was a vicious cancer, corrupting the morals of his younger generation. What a terrible weapon we could be using if we were creative enough.
And US President Joe Biden, who was in Brussels to discuss Russia's invasion of Ukraine at the G7 meeting, condemned North Korea's missile launch. And Biden met with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida on the sidelines of the G7 meeting and agreed to continue working together to hold North Korea accountable. Dr. Bennett, was North Korea seizing the chance when the world is focused on Russia and Ukraine?
Well, sure, it's seizing the opportunity there, but as Scott suggested, Kim has had a timetable. He's trying to accelerate into these capabilities as quickly as possible. He's got his own internal problems, let's face it. There's a lot of instability in North Korea. Not so much that he's worried about a collapse tomorrow, but there's instability there. And by doing these things, he is demonstrating power. He is demonstrating strength. And those are key to convincing his elite that he's a viable leader, he's a powerful leader, he's going to make a difference. So I think those are the more driving factors. Nevertheless, you look at the U.S. reaction, wasn't it exactly what Kim wanted? To be denounced? Perfect, because then it shows his leaders that the U.S. is worried about him. The U.S. is fearful of him because he's so powerful. We're playing right into his hands.
There's definitely an opportunistic element here, but I think that also it was fortuitous that President Biden was meeting with Prime Minister Kishida, because after all, this ICBM test involved a landing about 100 miles off of Japan's coast and clearly within Japan's exclusive economic zone. So naturally, the people of Japan are going to be alarmed by the resumption of long-range missile testing and the potential risk and frankly danger of accidents that could lead to fatalities within Japan if anything goes wrong on these overflights or even shortened trajectories that would cause casualties in Japan.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, will the Biden administration be able to handle these two different situations at the same time?
Yeah, I think that the Biden administration has to handle both of these challenges at the same time, but the way in which they may be handled will probably also demonstrate some limitations. And what I mean by that is I think it's highly likely that one challenge could be managed in order to buy time, while the other challenge is the one that gains focus. And in these circumstances, at this point, it's the Russian invasion of Ukraine where we're seeing lives lost, and it's the bigger crisis.
Well, the U.S. has the capability to tackle both. The question is, does it have the creativity? Because what we're finding is the tried and true measures, as Scott has suggested, with regard to North Korea and with regard to Russia, aren't viably working at this stage. We've got to come up with new ideas, and we don't seem to be coming up with those ideas. We can't just do same old in this case. We've got to take some new approaches. And for whatever reason, that creativity doesn't seem to be there right now.
Meanwhile, South Korea's President Moon Jae-in also condemned North Korea right after the missile was reported to be on the ICBM. With just a month left before he leaves the office, do you think it shows his North Korea's policy didn't work out as he had hoped? Dr. Bennett first.
Well, I think the answer is yes, it didn't work out, but you can't blame President Moon necessarily. The problem here is he started with an assumption. The assumption was that Kim Jong-un wanted peace. He only wanted to have a good natural relationship in the region. That obviously wasn't the case. Kim Jong-un wanted empowerment. He wanted to have these kinds of capabilities. And so you start with the wrong assumption, you're not necessarily going to get to the outcome you want. He tried, but now we've got to come up with a new set of assumptions about where Kim is really trying to go and what we can do to manage that. Because if we try to manage him getting the assumptions wrong, we're not going to be very successful.
Well, I think that the aspiration is understandable, that a South Korean president like Moon Jae-in would want to try to create a pathway for peaceful denuclearization involving active negotiation between the United States and North Korea. But it just turns out that in fact, as Bruce has suggested, I mean, the North Korean leadership is going in a different direction, looking at the world in a different way. And so I think the end result is going to be that, in fact, there is very little legacy for Moon to lean on as related to policy toward North Korea.
And South Korea President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol stressed a strong stance toward North Korea and a tighter alliance with the United States. Mr. Snyder, how is Yoon expected to deal with the North Korean issue when he comes into office?
Well, I would go back to what Bruce suggested, and that is that what we need is creativity. The occasion of a transition in leadership in South Korea provides an opportunity for a new team in South Korea to bring fresh ideas about how to grapple with the challenge of containing North Korea's continued military development. And we'll see if they're up to the task. And that does mean that it's also an opportunity for the Biden administration to recalibrate its approach. And I think that what we're likely to see is a greater emphasis on deterrence, first of all, in response to North Korea's advancements. But I also hope that there is room for a strategy that uses all the instruments at our disposal in order to try to turn North Korea in a different direction.
I think it's time for the two countries to basically put a proposal on the table. It can't be all sticks in the old U.S. concept of carrots and sticks. We have to offer some positive incentives to Kim while being very clear that if he continues to misbehave, there will be punishments that he won't like. So I think there's got to be the combination. But let's put a proposal on the table. Let's offer him some things. Let's let the people on the Korean Peninsula, in China, in the region, know that there isn't any U.S. and ROC hostility towards North Korea. We want to have good relationships with North Korea. This is all a North Korean excuse for its own bad behavior. We've got to turn things around, and I think the Yoon administration will have that opportunity.
VOA exclusively reported until very recently, North Korea was using the computers manufactured by the U.S. computer maker Dell. To the inquiry by VOA, Dell responded saying that they're investigating the matter. And this could be just another example of how North Korea is able to evade the sanctions the international community has been imposing on it. Dr. Bennett and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.